Hey students, this is Mrs. Donahue and this is our overtime recording session. I am the peak of annoyance because I really thought that the camera was recording for the last 15 minutes. But apparently if you launch the PowerPoint that you're reading from, camera decides it's not working anymore. So I'm very disappointed. Anyway, I am doing some lead-in lessons. I'm going to try to keep the videos sort of short in two different segments of the PowerPoint. For you guys, mostly for your ease, so that as you're going through the History of America PowerPoint, you're not bored by an hour-long lecture. Things to consider with the History of America PowerPoint. This is not necessarily meant to replace your history classes. Some of this information is old, some of it is new, probably. We're looking at particular segments of the history, foundational elements of America, things that we see as essential, or things that are enduring, so they continue evolving into the modern time. We're hoping that a lot of these things are elements of what you believe in or inspirational to what you believe in, or might help you understand more of what you believe in. Maybe you just weren't aware of some of these influences. As we go through, I'm looking at the PowerPoint on my split screen, and I'm going through it, and just remember, I'll cue you, but periodically I've put checkpoints, do-nows, things that break up doing the PowerPoint so that it's not too one-directional and boring. So keep in mind you should be doing that work. I also want to reiterate, some of it is a hard enough task. Like I gave you in one part, you'll read Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, an excerpt that I annotated. So just because you're not doing the editing down, just because you're not doing the annotation, doesn't mean that you should blow off the reading. I expect that it will be read because I expect that it will be used on assessments we're doing next week. So the reading is hard enough. That's why it's what you're doing alone. If you really don't think that it's graded unless there's questions that go with it, we're going to have a rough time. Trust Mama. I wouldn't give you anything that I thought was too much for you. And I am trying to keep it interesting enough in small enough chunks that you can get through it. I do like doing these PowerPoints live with you. I do kind of miss that right now. I do a good PowerPoint presentation. First things first, you're going to have on slide 3 the pre-question do now. Please make sure that you do it. It's just two simple questions. What is a colony and what brought the original colonists to America? It's not like you can get it right or wrong. I just want to see what you already know about that, particularly if I don't start by kind of focusing you on the word colony and colonists. It gets a little wonky here in the Revolutionary War period, the early establishing period of America. Actually, this way before Revolutionary War. The purposes of a colony. For our conversation piece, we're obviously looking at English colonies, British colonies. At one point it was said that the sun never set on the British Empire, because at one point during the day somewhere you were on a British colony. England owned many places, among them Australia, India, different islands like Bermuda, Ireland, Scotland, parts of Canada, parts of Africa, and also obviously America. These were owned for different reasons, most of which were strategic, and then eventually, over the course of World War I and II mostly, England started just shedding colonies. It still has a few of these, but by no means does it have the full breadth of the previous empire. Australia was a penal colony. It shares that with America. In other words, besides being a funny word, it means it's a prison colony. So if you committed a crime in England that was serious enough that you could have gone to prison, you were sometimes offered transportation as a sentence. Sometimes you weren't offered it, you were just assigned it. But that meant that instead of doing, say, 5 years hard labor in an urbanized English prison, you would do 5 years in Australia or 5 years in America. What are the advantages and disadvantages of this? Urbanized prisons are, in general, still today, nowhere you want to be. Too many people, too small a space, bad hygiene, hard labor in those places. It's what killed Oscar Wilde. But you would be chained to a bunch of other people. in whatever weather conditions you were in, and you were breaking rocks with hammers and other glorious activities. They were physically grueling. They were meant to be. It was supposed to be how you kept yourself out of trouble, how you atoned for your sins. Whereas in Australia, and even in America, it might have looked a little bit more like how you would imagine indentured servitude. You were working outside, you were working on building buildings or farming lands. If I had to choose to be, say, in the winter in a non-heated, overcrowded prison in the middle of London, or if I had to be out in the middle of Australia, I would pick the middle of Australia, if for no other reason than the disease rate would be much lower. In the world of COVID, I'm sure you guys can appreciate that. India and the islands and parts of Africa were mostly used for the exoticness of their farming. So they had silks, they had spices, they had sugar, they had other valuable things that you would, food products mostly that you would farm. They did have things like silks and jewels as well. And Africa also had ivory. So exotic resources, luxury items, things that were expensive, led to very valuable trade. You had resources coming out of Ireland and Scotland and Canada and America, but of a different nature. Like we weren't the ones that they got their luxury goods from. You were getting things like fur and wool from them. America was also, when they figured out how to plant their goods in America, we were also fairly good for that as well. But mostly, America's use was really about how much space we had. Transportation was a formal sentence, so prisoners were sent here. But it was also like, hey, this is a very good place to throw a bunch of people we don't want. So unwanted people who were causing civil unrest in England were sometimes offered transportation to America. Not as a formal punishment, but as a, hey, why don't you go over there so that you're causing fewer problems? In particular, religious extremism. If in a nutshell I had to summarize why this would be a problem in England, you had Henry VIII, hundreds of years before this, and Henry VIII wasn't so much into the religion of his time so much as he was into having many different women in his bed. He really wanted a male heir. Now the issue was his illegitimate children were male, but his legitimate children were only female. He had one daughter, he had an old wife, she was very Catholic, he was Catholic, and he decided he needed to divorce this wife. So he did, left her for his mistress who was pregnant, and he was convinced this was going to be like the heir apparent. This was going to be the male. The Pope did not like this whole thing, and Henry basically had to leave the Catholic Church and establish his own church where he was the head of it. So he doesn't have to answer to the Pope. He only has to answer to himself if he wants a divorce. He does this to marry Anne Boleyn. Anne Boleyn then has a daughter. To me, the greatest moment of history is Henry VIII losing his mind over having a second daughter, not realizing that he has just fathered one of the most powerful heads of state to ever exist. Hindsight's 20/20. But Henry VIII left the Catholic Church. This really put all the Catholics in England out. A lot of them loved his old wife. They hated the new wife. He then beheaded the new wife, married someone else. So all the marrying of Henry VIII becomes a push-pull between Catholics and Protestants. Then he dies. He does eventually have the male heir, but the male heir is very, very sick. Dies as a child. Tries to leave. They try to get another cousin in. Then that doesn't work out. It goes back to his Catholic daughter. You may recognize her by one of her urban legend nicknames, Mary the First, Bloody Mary. She slaughters the Protestants of England. Very good way to get them to listen to you. She creates a massacre of civil unrest because she is very Catholic. Her mother was very Catholic. Her mother was Spanish. Spain was very, very Catholic at this time. And let's face it, she was really resentful of her father creating all this religious and political unrest to just have another child that she felt very competitive with. Mary is old. She thought she was pregnant. I mean, she was like in her late 50s or 60s when she was like, I think I'm pregnant. It was a giant tumor. So she dies, and then Elizabeth I comes to power in England. She is the longest reigning monarch at her time. Now, she's going to be the start of the 1600s, which is just before this time period. We actually start seeing letters about America going to Elizabeth. So she was aware of it, and it was something that they were toying with the idea of. Virginia is named for Elizabeth because she was the Virgin Queen. So when Elizabeth becomes queen, she realizes that stabilizing the political sphere and the religious sphere go hand in hand. So she walked a very fine line of trying not to create more political and social upheaval. But she does this in a non-traditional way. She doesn't marry. She never has children, which makes a lot of the traditionalists in England a little crazy. The the scarring from this exists over the next century. You have Catholics and Protestants fighting over things, particularly resources, things like where the money goes. In a very practical way, if you are giving money to church every week, who is getting that money? Is it going to the Pope? Is it going to the King? The King is the head of the church in the Church of England. So are you paying the king both taxes and are you giving him money at church? What's happening? Are those resources being used properly? You had a lot of, dog-eat-dog street fighting over like political unrest and religious unrest. And those two things went hand in hand. Having one often made the other appear if it wasn't already there. So how do you answer this question? You can't officially say that there's two religions in England because the king or queen would have to choose one. So if they choose Catholic, then the Protestants feel put out. If they choose Protestant, then the Catholics feel put out. An issue here is what do we do with the other half? So you eventually get to a place where the answer becomes, well, who is our biggest problem at the time? And even though they remained Protestant in England, the Calvinists became a really big problem. Who are the Calvinists? So happy that you're asking. When you're looking at religious extremism, Calvinists are going to be among the biggest. Now, before we get to why we're shipping people here with religion, where exactly are we shipping them? You have to, and this is like the early slides by 7 and 8, you have to realize that America was not the romantic, desirable landscape that you may have envisioned it was. As much as I'm going to love on Hamilton in a little bit, even Hamilton does a poor job of selling you what America really was at the time. There was nothing here. You're leaving England where there are cities and towns and roads, where there's an established infrastructure that does not exist here. Everything that we brought to America, we built with our own hands. That sounds awful, cool, and nice, but it is grueling, miserable, back-breaking work. There are no shipping locations. There is only existing food that you were unfamiliar with. So your existing diet could not kind of gently roll into what you found there. The foreign populace that you interacted with, because you're always going to interact with other natives, they had extremely different ways of understanding social culture. So like when we met Native Americans, it was very hard to communicate about how we understood culture to look. For good, for bad, for indifferent. Like they had a totally different idea of owning land and property that we did not have. So like when we went there and we're like, well, what's yours? They're like, we has everything we share. And we were like, no, we put fences around ours. So which part do we fence? There's different weather. I don't know if you guys ever kind of appreciated it, but on the kind of map, England's slightly more north than us, colder, wetter, different growing cycles, slightly different seasons. So it was slightly warmer, slightly drier, everything we had to relearn. You had nobody with you. You had no family with you, no friends, no existing social structure outside of what came with you on the boat, which could have been a bunch of criminals, or it could have been people from your religiously extreme church. There were not many possibilities for you. That might sound like, ooh, welcome relief, but you guys can imagine what isolation does to people now, especially in a corona world. You can imagine what it's like to literally be divorced and divided from everyone that you're familiar with. There's also almost no way to get back. If you say, imagine you made a mistake, you've been doing this for 4 months and you are going crazy and you really need to not do it anymore, there's almost no way to get home. It took months and months and months on a boat to get to America. There was not a regular boating schedule, so there was no guarantee when the opportunity to leave would happen. There is a really good documentary on the Salem witch trials that I sometimes show. I don't know if I'll figure it out because of the sharing problems, but one of the people, one of the historians that they quote there said, your life in England had to be so trying, so difficult, so miserable, so unwanted, that coming across the world to start a civilization out of absolutely nothing with your bare hands seems better. And I really like how she phrases that. That's how awful it had to be in England to make America seem remotely appealing. So again, the people coming here, they didn't have anything to lose. In general, you're escaping crimes or you're a criminal. You had no family in England that could help you, so you were already alone, widows and orphans sometimes. You were often sold into indentured servitude, which was similar enough to slavery. You were stuck in your social class and you desperately wanted out, or you were generally unwanted. So that sounds great, right? Sounds like a stirring recommendation to come to America. This population, and I'm posing a question to you on slide 12, what sort of population does it seem like, and do you imagine that everyone got along? Even if they didn't get along, they worked together. They had to or they would die. So there's also a lot of tension there with like, I have to work 12, 14, 16-hour days next to you, and we disagree on almost everything. We agree we don't want to die, which is good. It's a good place to start. But we don't agree on anything else because you're here because you committed petty crimes in England and now you're trying to buy land and become a farmer. And I'm here because I am a Calvinist and I don't want to follow the religious laws of England because England's not strict enough. I want to live a strict religious lifestyle and you want to grow stuff out of the ground. And I don't know if we're going to be able to come together on why we're in this country. But you have to ignore that. You guys know what happens when you ignore tensions. Obviously, they go away, right? They don't build up over time. So the Calvinists, this is a big idea. Of the Protestant religions, there's many different varieties. Calvinism is one of those varieties. So a lot of times students say, like, what's the difference between like Catholic and Christian? Well, like under Christianity, you'll have Catholic and Protestant, and then under Catholic and Protestant, you'll have different subcategories. So Calvinism is a type of Protestantism. They believed that essentially people weren't being strict enough. So then underneath Calvinism, you have the real hardcore. We are the purest examples of religious living on earth. The Puritans. They were among the core group of people who established America. So you have extremism in Calvinism, and then you put sprinkles on top, and that's Puritanism. This is how extreme they were. So by now I'm on slide 14 if you're following along. Puritans were extremists in their own time. in a time period that you would already see as religiously conservative. It is universal that people believe in God. Universal religious belief. It's just which God you believe in. You would not kind of understand the degree to which Puritans believed in cleansing sin and bad behavior from their community. We have nothing left that's sort of similar to this. They wanted to purify the Anglican Church of its immorality. So their big problem was that they thought the Catholic Church was corrupt, and then Protestantism was supposed to save Christianity, and then Protestantism didn't go far enough. Particularly Anglicanism didn't go far enough. They literally believed they could create a perfect community. They called this a city on a hill. A city on a hill, a light to all people, an example of how to live. I hope that you understand when I call it a perfect place, that I'm also kind of going utopia. And I hope you realize, based on even the couple of books you read in middle school on dystopias, you can never achieve utopia. It is an unachievable goal, but they didn't believe this. They believed sort of, if you want it enough and work hard enough, of course you can have it. At the same time that the way they understand the world is incredibly paranoid, incredibly dark, incredibly heavy, kind of hard to deal with. Why? You might mistake me by saying that they are a Christian religious extremist group as saying that they are very focused on God. They are not. In many ways, they are more focused on their worry and concern about the devil and sin than they are about the love of God. And that's because of a few reasons. One, coming to America made it darker on them. The Puritans of England that stayed in England had a slightly different view of it than the ones who came to America, and it darkened everything they did, literally. Also, Puritanism already believed that you were born chosen to go to heaven. But most of us were not going. So you could live your whole life being perfect and still not be one of the pre-chosen people. To put it in perspective, in a classroom of 25, maybe one of you would be part of the elect. But here's the thing, there's no way of knowing. So in a classroom of 25, I say one of you is part of the elect, one of you is going to heaven. But I don't ever tell you which one. So you spend your whole life looking for signs that you cannot read, signs from God that you're a member of his chosen people. Did my crops all die because God is testing me because as one of his chosen people, I have the ability to rise above it? Maybe. Did my children all die in the winter because I am sinful and I am not among God's chosen people? Maybe. This is a big maybe. We don't know. You believed that God's plan was unknowable at the same time that he had already made all the decisions, and you were trying to figure out whether you were in it or not, because it's a natural human condition, right? I want to know if I'm part of the elect. You also could not risk that your bad behavior would somehow remove you to hell. So they were obsessed with avoiding sin and the devil, obsessed with it. And they believed that the devil was literally walking among them. I am officially Chris from Parks and Rec, literally. They believed the devil actually physically walked the earth, particularly in the woods. Now, I don't know if you have any idea what colonial America looked like, but it was covered in woods, covered in them. They weren't cleared for cities. They weren't cut down yet, so there was just trees as far as the eye could see. So they believed the devil walked among people, hiding and seducing people to the dark side, very Darth Vader style. They also believed that the devil's helpers, witches, walked among us. This was not funny to them at all. They literally feared it, and to the point where there are books, handbooks, guidebooks on finding witches. I love these guidebooks. I've read a couple of them. The Maleficent Maleficarum's really good. The Witch's Hammer, the Devil's Hammer, Witch's Hammer, Witch's Hammer. There's a few, and they have these signs of identifying witches. In a great pre-corona world, I would pull a handful of you and look you over for signs of witchcraft. I would find them, because of course I would. They're easy to find when you're looking for them. In other words, if any among you have moles or birthmarks, probably a witch. If any of you have sort of freckles or moles hidden in your hair, witch. If you're left-handed, forget it, witch. If any of you have like a fun third nipple, definitely witch. Definitely. I make that joke for Mrs. Mitchell. I hope she hears this. She made a joke about a third nipple once. I've always held on to it. There are many other things that would get you dinged as a witch. Many of them behavioral. So consider living in a perfect society, surrounded by people, striving for perfection, which we all know is not achievable, but they don't accept that. They're going to live perfect lifestyles, perfect moral lifestyles, all together. No one can be the weak link in that chain. On top of that, they are desperately afraid of bad behavior, desperately afraid of sin. They see it like a contagious disease. Like the moment like tiny bits of sin get into the town, it's just going to take over and everyone's going to fall and we're all going to be useless and we're all going to go to hell. And this is a horribly anxiety-ridden way to live. Puritans were an inherently sexist society. It kind of goes without saying that most societies were at this point, but the Puritans really doubled down on it because Eve, sin, not good. This was really hard for them to live with. So at the same time that you can't think about sin, you can't think about it, don't think about it, don't think about pink elephants, don't think about sin, don't think about the things you're not supposed to have. They naturally thought about it all the time. And the sexism in their society made it worse because there was a lot of punishing about actual sex too. Sexual repression, sexual urges, sexual misbehavior or behavior in general was heavily policed. So like, look at women. Look at maybe young girls. Not too young, but like, late teens, early 20s. Girls who are becoming women, girls who are becoming marriageable age. I mean, we gotta put all of that on lockdown because obviously they can't be trusted, not to just become witches who barter with the devil and become sinful, lustful creatures who corrupt men. We obviously gotta keep this on lock. Don't think about pink elephants. While you're striving to have everybody behave well, you're telling them not to behave certain ways, and then naturally that's the only thing they think about. We know this is how people work, it's how psychology works, and yet they somehow didn't believe that that's how it worked. They just didn't want it to be true, but it was. Puritan society strictly forbid dancing, drinking, game playing of any kind. That includes for children. No playing of games. No playtime or casual time. There was no like you didn't come back from doing work and take a break. There was none of that. There was obviously no premarital sex, obviously no gambling, nothing that distracted between work and religion. You woke up, you prayed, you went to work, you took a prayer break. That was the only kind of break you could take. You went to work, you ate something, you prayed, you went to sleep, rinse, repeat. The only day that was like a day without work would have been Sunday, a day of full prayer. It was expected that you went to church and worshiped regularly. There was obviously a huge deal and an emphasis put on Sunday worship. It was the only day you were not required to work, but you could work. But they were definitely watching. There was incredible peer pressure to be the best Puritan, to be the one who was worshiping the best and the most purely. So say you were a Puritan, you're not going to skip Sunday service because everybody's going to watch and everybody's going to know. But like, Think of the regular Protestants that are over there. Do you think they're obsessing over it, or do you think they're like, I might have to, bring in the crops on Sunday because it rained on Friday and I just didn't get it done, and Sunday is going to be my day. They're not worried as much as the Puritans are. The Puritans are in constant fear for their souls, whereas other Protestants aren't really living with this kind of anxiety. Hard work was always a key virtue of Puritans. They kind of believed that the way you avoid sin is you work so hard that you just don't have time for it, right? You're going to work hard. Now, I said when you came to America, it is a landscape that literally the ground's not tilled, the trees aren't cut down. They do not have any other resources besides what is raw and in front of them. You want a house, you got to go cut down half a forest of trees, make the timber yourself, make something to join that timber together with, be it nails or some sort of adhesive. You have to manufacture all of this from the ground up if you want a house. That's daunting. You need people who are hardworking. Hard work needs to be valued. The problem is when the Puritans came from England, where it's a totally different style of hard work, right? You could be a hard worker in England and still have a lot of creature comforts, a lot of convenience. You come to America, you got to put it on overdrive or you will die. That level of anxiety was introduced in America. Like, they didn't have that in England. You could work hard or like hardish and not die. In America, you got to be at 13 all the time, or you're going to die. And you probably might die anyway, because there's a lot going on here. We have natives that we're occasionally fighting with, or fighting with each other. There's disease, there's a shortage of supplies, there's starvation. I mean, it's not good. So imagine what that does to already very tense, very hardworking people. It doesn't make them more sane. It, if anything, causes some great unraveling. In Puritan communities, there was a very, very strict hierarchy. Now, I'm going to go over that hierarchy now and then rehash it when I go through Scarlet Letter and Crucible, but I'm going to do them in a separate video. At the very top of the hierarchy, the most powerful people in society were the religious leaders, who were exclusively men. Women were not allowed to lead religious services of any kind. Underneath that, you have wealthy merchants and landowners, so people with money. Why? Because they have money. Money always talks. Usually these were men. Usually, 99% of the time, but there are exceptions to this rule. Women could get there. Typically, they were widowed. More on that in Crucible and Scarlet Letter. Especially in Crucible, it comes up. Underneath that, underneath wealthy merchants and landowners, you have farmers. Farmers are always men. It's too physical of a job. I'm not trying to be sexist here, but there were just role divisions at this time. You very rarely had women farmers. You had farmers' wives who assisted, but women had difficulty running a farm on their own. They had other things to do. More on that later. Married men were underneath farmers, so farmers could be single and married. Underneath them were married men who did not have a different role like a farmer. Underneath that were adolescent or unmarried men who did not have some other role. Underneath them were married women. Underneath them were unmarried women. Underneath them were children, and among the child set, boys were more valued than girls. So at the very lowest rung of society, you had adolescent and pre-adolescent girls. Nobody was lower than them except slaves. Again, more on this in Crucible. Now, just to kind of wrap up the idea of Puritanism, I would like to show you what they name their children. So these are Puritan names. They typically go to girls. They don't have to just go to girls, though. But these were the most popular Puritan baby names. We have these in records. I am not making these up. In fact, if anything, I have toned it down. There are some I didn't put on here because you would not have believed me and you would have made fun of me. So here they are. Humiliation. Think of a last name like Andrews or Smith. You had Humiliation Smith, Prudence Andrews, Credence Smith, Verity Smith, Abstinence Smith, Reformation Smith, mercy, Smith, silence, faith, Mary, patience, remembrance, grace, hope, obedience. I like fear the Lord also. That has dashes in it. It's technically one word because of the dashes. Hate evil is also a good one. Think of what a parent has to be motivated by, that they look at their child and they go, name it humiliation. Because these names do one of two things. Either they give you something to do, you will be merciful, you will be silent, you will be patient, or they give you something to avoid. You will avoid humiliation. You will be abstinent, you will avoid immoral behavior. You have to live with that name every day, every single solitary day. I mean, in contrast, think of like what motivates people to name their kids now. I have some fun celebrity ones for you to consider on there, from the Kardashians to the Musk family to various and sundry celebrities. But like, what motivates you to name your son Kal-El Cage? What motivates you to name your son Sir, or to name your daughter Honest? As you consider that and ponder it, we will have another video that goes over sinners in the hands of an angry God, and also goes over the crucible and hopefully Scarlet Letter. The Scarlet Letter might become its own video. Make sure you are doing any of the little bits along the way, and it's been fun.